So what I intend to do in this paper is to offer a kind of summation, really, of my academic work over the last 25 years. And along the way, I will try and make some allusions between the work I've done in the UK, primarily with African Caribbean people. So I'm part of the African diaspora. My parents were working class people in the Caribbean, part of the British Empire. They came to Britain in the late 1950s as migrants. And then I was born in 1964, eldest of 4 children. And so a lot of my work has been against the backdrop of colonialism and neocolonialism. And so the framing of this work is very much within a post-colonial context. So in terms of the background to my work, my scholarship has always existed at the nexus of Black theology and practical theology. In terms of the latter, my work has been concerned with using the frameworks of radical, liberative modes of education as a conduit for undertaking practical theology. And the purpose of this work is the conscientization of ordinary lay people and those training for public Christian ministry. My participative approach to undertaking practical theology is one that has seen me use models of experiential learning, such as exercises and games, role plays and drama, as an interactive means of engaging with adult learners in order that they can be impacted by, learn from, and contribute to the development of new knowledge concerning the theory and practice of Black theology. A related but slightly different part of that ongoing work has been concerned with working with predominantly white lay people in terms of conscientizing them to live out their Christian faith as anti-racist ambassadors for a liberative model of Christianity. This work often sees me leading workshops on Christian discipleship for lay people across the UK. And the underlying epistemological frameworks of this particular approach to the Christian faith formation is one that draws on the radical tradition bequeathed to all educators, I believe, by the great Paulo Freire. So therefore, I want to look for a few moments at the underlying values of this work. Paulo Freire's groundbreaking work in devising appropriate pedagogies for teaching marginalized and oppressed peoples is legendary. Freire developed a philosophy of education that challenged poor and oppressed people to reflect on their individual and corporate experience and begin to ask critical questions about the nature of their existence. And so the radical nature of this critical approach to the task of teaching and learning brought Freire to the attention of the military government in Brazil in 1964. He was subsequently imprisoned and then exiled. In exile, he began to refine further his educational philosophy and method. He came to the international attention with the publication of his first book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, in which he laid down the foundations for a seismic shift in the whole conception of how poor, oppressed, and marginalized peoples might be educated. In the realms of theological thought and Christian education, Freire's ideas are credited with being an invaluable source for Gustavo Gutierrez's groundbreaking text, A Theology of Liberation, and the basis for a committed and ideologically driven theology of and for the poor. Freire's later work in the World Council of Churches throughout the 70s and 80s, which also, I believe, included some work in Southern Africa. As an international consultant, led his work becoming hugely significant in various parts of the world, especially amongst poor and oppressed peoples of the globe of the South. Freire died in Rio de Janeiro on May 2nd, 1997 at the age of 75. And he has bequeathed a legacy of commitment, love and hope for oppressed peoples throughout the world. The importance of Paulo Freire, I believe, cannot be overstated. In developing a rigorous and critical approach to the task of educating those who are poor and oppressed, Freire created an essential template by which religious educators and practical theologians might reconceptualize their task. One of Freire's central concepts was that of conscientization. This is a process whereby poor and oppressed peoples become politically aware of the circumstances in which they live and the ways in which their humanity is infringed upon and blighted by the often dehumanizing context that surround them. And so the words of Alan J. Moore, one of the early disciples of Freire, he says of Freire's work, and I quote, "Conscientization in Freire's work is apparent both an individual experience and a shared experience of a people who are acting together in history. A way of life is not determined from thinking about the world, but it's formed from the shared praxis. In this critical approach to the world, basic attitudes, values, and beliefs are formed, and the people are humanized or liberated. Conscientization, therefore, leads to a life lived with a consciousness of history, a life lived that denounces and transforms this history in order to form a new way of life for those who are oppressed." End of quote. Freire's approach to education has opened up new vistas for religious educators along with pastoral and practical theologians. His work contains a profound humanizing spirit that draws extensively on his Roman Catholic upbringing and catechesis. The one who would not consider himself to be a theologian or a religious educator, Freire's work has always been marked by firm, implicit theistic content. This became increasingly visible as his writing matured in his advanced years. John Elias, in his assessment of Freire as a religious educator, and I would also say a practical theologian, he states the following, and I quote, "The religious element in Freire's social philosophy has become increasingly more explicit in his later writings and speeches. He sees the Christian gospel as proclaiming the radical reordering of society in which men are oppressed. Christians who involve themselves in revolutionary action against oppression involve themselves in a new Passover, a new Easter." End of quote. Freire's concern for the radical and revolutionary intent of education as a basis for socio-political change forms the underlying epistemological framework for my pedagogical approach to teaching and engaging in practical theology. And I want to say something about practical theology as a form of participative pedagogy. That whilst Freire provides the underlying philosophical approach to the pedagogical intentionality of my work, the more specific practical theological dimensions have been influenced by British scholars such as Ballard and Pritchard, Forrester and Graham, who have all theorized around the development of practical theology as a model of reflective activity in which the theologian interrogates the connections between theory and practice of Christianity, in their diverse range of contexts and settings. And so practical theology, as I'm sure many of you know in this guild, is the overall framework to the Christian faith that uses different models of thinking such as psychology, counseling, education, sociology, anthropology, for example, as ways of looking at God's action in the world. That one of the central tasks of practical theology is to consider the relationship between how the church and individual Christians have considered the meaning of faith in light of what individuals and churches actually do in their daily lived attempts to give expression to what they believe. And so the development of my work as a practical theologian came initially from my doctoral work in the discipline of Christian education. And the term Christian education can be defined and understood in a variety of ways. Jeff Astley and Colin Crowder provide a helpful starting point for the definition and rationale for Christian education. The authors describe Christian education thus, and I quote, "The phrase often used quite generally to refer to those processes by which people learn to become Christian and to be more Christian through learning Christian beliefs, attitudes, values, emotions, and dispositions, to engage in Christian actions, and to be open to Christian experiences." End of quote. So in my work as an educator, what underpins the pedagogical approach to practical theology, that is concerned with transform the critical consciousness of predominantly lay learners within workshop context. That in that context, that I see my work as a means of exploring an anti-racist discipleship. And so I'm concerned with providing an accessible framework for the radical reinterpretation of the Christian faith for the transformation of ordinary people. In undertaking the bulk of this work, often in relatively informal workshops as well as in more formal classroom settings, such as the one where I've been earlier today in Oxford University, I've developed a creative and participative method for teaching practical theology. I've identified this as a form of what I have called performative action. And so performative action requires that we creatively engage with the other in a socio-constructive space, often the workshop setting or a classroom, in which all the participants promise to engage with the other in a fashion that affirms mutuality, cooperation, and a shared commitment to the production of new knowledge. This production of new knowledge is not simply for the purposes of passing exams or writing term papers, but ultimately that the desire is to create new forms of knowing for the express purposes of changing behavior and developing better praxis in Christian discipleship. And the purpose and the process of performative action operates often within informal workshop settings in which I seek to create safe space that affords predominantly ordinary lay people to reflect critically on self and their engagement with others as Christian disciples, in contexts and cultures that inform their experiences as human beings. In this participative pedagogical approach to practical theology, I've used a variety of exercises and activities for enabling participants to explore their feelings and emotions in a safe space. That the exercises allow people to adopt imaginary roles and to park their sometimes extreme feelings in a comparatively safe rest area where they can notionally ascribe responsibility for their anger and frustration or sense of tension to the fictional persona of the character that they have adopted in the exercise. In the use of performative, participative approaches to practical theology, for the purposes of encouraging adult learners to engage in the practice of anti-racist models of Christian discipleship, that for me, one of the key themes of this comes from Martin Luther King Jr.'s notion of the beloved community. And so the beloved community becomes its essential heuristic in this work. In the use of exercises and also drama, this represents an invitation for individual learners to reflect within the hospitable and safe space of the workshop. It's in this context that they can explore and commit themselves to working for and become part of a collective and spiritual and psychological journey of the Christian church towards the so-called promised land of racial justice. It's what in effect I would describe as the reign of God or God's gracious economy. In the various exercises, participants by means of conversation and interaction have the opportunity to reflect on their action within the context of a central activity and to assess their agency and responses to it for its truthfulness to God's gracious activity in Jesus Christ, when juxtaposed with the historical and contemporary experience of racism. At this point, I'll just slightly depart from my written script and just share a very, very personal story. So the first time I went to South Africa was in 2004. And one of the places I went to as a Methodist, I was invited by the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, was I spent a week in the then John Wesley Theological College in Kinnerton. And the thing that struck me in the week I was there in 2004 with Methodist training for Methodist ministry was how in 2004, some 10 years after so-called universal franchisement in terms of democracy, although the legal separations of apartheid had been ended, what one now had is what I would call the resulting informal forms of class-based separation between black and white. So the week I was there, I had several conversations with many Black, African, and so-called coloured students who were training for ministry. I never saw any of the white students, that they would turn up for class at the last minute and then leave very quickly after the class. And it struck me that one of the observations I made, and I made this by no means of criticism, it's just simply an observation because I was very new to the context, and even now it would not be my place to make any critical judgments on a context in which I am not earthed and have not been socialized, was that what seemed to be lacking was any space where people could be confronted with the other and to wrestle with the affect of our socialization, formation as Christian believers. But it's one thing to learn ideas in a cognitive fashion, and I'm certainly not discounting that, and I'm certainly not dismissing it. But also it seemed to me that what was happening was a kind of parallel existence in which the white students did not live on campus. They drove in or came in. They came in for classes. At that moment, there was a juxtaposition of Black and so-called coloured people alongside white people for a present moment in the church that has always claimed to be undivided and to be one, in which there were parallel experiences that were touched upon briefly within classes that looked at particular theological ideas that did not always, it seemed to me, land in a contextual way that challenged the lived realities of people in the classroom. And then at the end of it, people left, or more accurately, the white people left. It was usually the Black students who stayed around to talk to this strange individual with the strange accent who come all the way from Britain in order to engage with them whilst on study leave. That experience back in 2004 was quite suggestive for me because it struck me that in some respects, things are not that different in Britain. Maybe not as stark or as polarized, but there is still a sense in which there are parallel realities that are defined by race and class between those who are predominantly white and relatively comfortable and whose position in the church is seen as normative, and those who are on the margins who are largely Black, of African descent and some of Asian descent. And whilst there may well be a meeting point in the classroom, this tends to be a temporary interface before people then traverse back to their other contexts. And so the critical question is, at what point is there an intersectionality of engagement between lived realities and human subjectivities that becomes a conduit for real transformative change in terms of learning and praxis? It's in this regard that I would then move from the work of Paulo Freire to that of Augusto Boal. And Boal, like Freire, was also from Brazil. He was raised in Rio de Janeiro, initially trained as a chemical engineer and attended Columbia University in the late 1940s in America. Like Freire, his work has proved highly influential to liberationist theorists and practitioners across the world. And whereas Freire's work has been in the area of pedagogy and critical consciousness raising, Boal's input has found expression in theatre-based educational philosophy. So Boal's approach to drama and theatre is to collapse the emotional and conceptual distance between the performer on stage and the observer in the audience. In one famous incident, Boal stopped a performance in order that a disgruntled woman spectator could mount the stage and offer an alternative version to the untruth she was witnessing in the stage performance. This incident was to prove a pivotal moment in the development and career of Boal, for from it emerged this notion of the theatre of the oppressed. In his 1971 book of the same name, Boal used participative theatre as a means of ushering into being a self-conscious and a deliberate reconceptualization of theatre and drama in order to assist oppressed peoples to name and construct alternative realities to the subjugated and inhibited virgins that confront them daily. This link between theatre and politics, argues Boal, is not a new phenomenon, and Boal traces the roots of theatre as a response to and a mirror of one's contextual realities that dates back to the Greeks and the writings of Aristotle and Plato. In his 1971 book, republished in 2000, called Theatre of the Oppressed, Boal gives the most detailed explication of the conceptual ideas that underpin this particular phenomenon, this idea. And one important dimension of Boal's concept is the identification with the character in the play as a subject and the extent to which they are free and are able to exercise a sense of self-determination and are not purely objects onto which external factors are grafted. In Theatre of the Oppressed and in later works, Boal has not only refined the conceptual basis of his ideas around participatory theatre, but has added a number of practical training elements, the whole panoply of techniques and workshops that have grown out of his original theory. Boal's work is concerned with helping participants in the theatre, whether performers or spectators, and he collapses the separation between the two by talking of the spec actor. And the spec actor, his job is to interrogate truth by means of inhabiting a character and exploring potentially new concepts within the confines and structures of the play. In order that this concept of a participative, liberative theatre might come alive and deliver fresh insights into the lives of the oppressed, it's essential that the general underlying themes or subtext within any performance be concrete and of contextual relevance to the potential to our potential participants. And writing with this in respect to this issue, Boal states, and I quote, "The chosen subject must be an issue of burning importance, something known to be a matter of profound and genuine concern for the future spectators." And so the importance of locating key themes that speak to the experience of people in the workshops is one that resonates with the central ideas of Thomas Groome, one of the most influential liberationist practical theologians in the world. Groome's concept of generative themes is described thus, and I quote, "It is some historical issue, question, value, belief, concept, or event, situation that is likely to draw participants into engagement. And the use of generative themes is an attempt to locate a substantive subtext in which to develop an overarching approach to critically shared theological inquiry. In the context of my own work in terms of a participative approach to practical theology, I've used Boal's work augmented by Groome's creative understanding of generative themes in order to provide the methodology and the content for this workshop or classroom-based approach to shared practice-based modes of theological reflection." Again, I want to depart from the written script and just think about what then this means for practical theology in Southern Africa. So again, going back to 2004, although I've been on several times since, to South Africa since, I think it was that first visit that remains the most resonant in my experience because it was so new and it was the first time I was in the country. And the thing that struck me and has struck me ever since has been the facility many Africans, particularly Black Africans, have with moving juxtaposedly between different languages, between one of the 9 official languages that they have, and then being able to engage in English. And I've always found myself as someone who is part of the African diaspora in a very liminal position in those contexts, because when I'm in settings in which many Africans are speaking in their native tongue, which I applaud, I'm aware at that point of my very English socialization, where the only facility I have is English, which is, of course, the language of empire. Within the UK, in a much stark sense, one of the issues that we've had in theological education, particularly in terms of working with predominantly working class African Caribbean people, has been the extent to which they have to learn 2 different types of language. They have to learn the language of academic study, but they also have to learn the language and the lingua franca of a middle-class type of English in which to write their papers, which itself is the language of empire. And a significant challenge, therefore, I think, for practical theology, but particularly for Black theology, has been the extent to which can you do liberative work within the framework of a language that comes from empire and comes from an oppressive class. To misquote the words of Audre Lorde, can you dismantle the slave master's house using the slave master's tools? And so therefore there has been an ongoing conversation around issues of decolonization of knowledge in the British context, around how do we affirm indigenous languages, affirm alternative ways of knowing, because like we know that language is not simply a means of communication. Language itself is also a carrier of ideological worldviews. It's a carrier of lived experience. And therefore, there are concepts and ideas that simply do not translate from one idiom to another. And yet, the truth is, within British theological education, as I suspect is the case within Southern Africa, although I'm happy for Rothney and for others to challenge me otherwise. As I said, I make no claim to be an expert on the South African context. Is to what extent, therefore, theological education is often a form of socialization into a bourgeois, middle-class, pro-imperialistic construct in which the presence of the English language as is not only normative, but it is the guarantor for one's sense of socialization and formation into a form of respectability politics. And those who can't do that, or those who cannot make that traverse, or indeed those who refuse to do it, are often perceived as either as being difficult or being truculent, and certainly in terms of people turning to ministry, are usually not accepted, certainly not in my context. And so therefore, what the process of learning and formation is not simply about the growth into particular charisms and forms of knowledge acquisition. It's also a tacit form of conversion from an indigenous working class self into an acceptable middle class, pro-imperial, post-Constantinian form of institutional identity that robs one of any radical intent. So I say all this, therefore, in terms of now getting ready to conclude my comments by wondering to what extent is my own work able to develop and to outline the hopes I've always had for it, which is to have a revolutionary intent around how we rethink epistemology, around how we rethink what is acceptable knowledge, and indeed, how are we transforming the very framing of knowledge within the context of theological education as we train people for ministry and for lay discipleship within the life of the church. As a part of this work, I've tried also to use ethnography as a way of helping students to navigate and to rethink their own sense of agency and their subjectivity. And certainly in more recent times, I've moved on now to work with autoethnography, which is really where people are encouraged to reflect on their own learning and their lived experience as a means of helping them to frame that knowledge is not just something that happens out there in books, it's something that we accrue within our own life experiences. And part of the way in which empire, and particularly the language of whiteness using the work of Willie James Jennings has shown us, is that one of the conceits, I think, of the Western tradition is this assumption that there is no relationship between the knower and what is apparently known. And so therefore, when one reads the work of great white theologians, we have no sense of their interiority. We have no sense of the context, or no sense of the lived experience that shapes the creation of the work they have put together, that the choices that they make in terms of what they presume to be true or not is true, or what is worth knowing and what is not. I think part of the genius, I think, of Black theology has always been the way in which it's been much more transparent in terms of that relationship, in terms of who we are, helps determine what we write and what we believe and what we share with others. And therefore, the invitation to whiteness, which is some of the more recent work I'm doing now, is very much an invitation for white scholars to reflect on the nature of their whiteness, not in negative or deleterious terms, but certainly in terms of recognize that one's point of departure and therefore one's lived subjectivity has an impact, even if it's subconsciously, on the work that one produces, and that then gives rise to its presence within the broader academy in terms of what we see as learning and truth. And so therefore, in summation, it seems to me that the biggest challenge that has always confronted Black theology, which, as I said, is part of my dual identity. I'm a practical theologian who uses the frameworks of practical theology to do Black theology. I'm not a systematic theologian by training, nor am I an ethicist. So my work is very much looking at participative forms of education and learning, but what is often conceived as being part of the practical theology framework as means of doing Black liberation theology. And for me, that was an intention right from the nature of my doctoral work in the late 90s, because it seems to me that one of the criticisms that could be made of an early generation of Black liberation theologians is that they're theologized about, but rarely with, ordinary people. And so therefore I had to go back to the significance of the work of Boal and of Paulo Freire. It seems to me that like the next iteration of Black theology that becomes juxtaposed with and works in partnership with practical theology is how then do we find ways of making conscientization the central point of departure for our liberative work, and to do so as a partnership with ordinary people, enabling them to reflect on their own experience and to mine from that experience some of the liberative frameworks and some of the liberative operations of faith that have probably been buried quite deep because of colonization and empire, and to allow that to come to the forth and to flourish as forms of practice within ordinary communities, most notably and most normally the church. How then does the formal frameworks of our teaching and learning processes enable that to happen? Because it seems to me that in the British context, part of the difficulty is that there is still a major barrier that prevents many ordinary poor people from feeling that these august places of learning are ones in which they can be themselves and they can bring their lived experience and their subjective experience of knowledge to bear upon the teaching and learning process, rather than what tends to still to be the case, even though we say it's otherwise, where we often see such students in banking terms that Freire critique, which is that they're coming somehow devoid of knowledge and devoid of anything worth sharing, and the job of the educator is to fill them up and to deposit knowledge into them. Often deposit knowledge that may not have any relevance to their lived realities in terms of their points of departure. And so therefore, in summation, that what I offer, not as a critique, but as an invitation for you within the South African context, is to wonder to what extent are we still engaged in a bourgeois enterprise that is still framed by empire and framed by, the sense that there are vested interests around what is knowledge, and even indeed like the means by which that knowledge is often produced, which is a type of standard received English. I say this as someone who has no facility in any other language than English. And the Jamaican patois that is often spoken by working class Black people in Britain is something that I can speak very, very haltingly and hesitantly, because even in my own formation, in my family, we were prohibited from speaking that language, because that was the language of people who were seen as as lacking in respectability, and people who were beyond the confines of the church. And so therefore my final words are that it seems to me that one of the fundamental challenges, therefore, for Black theology, working through some of the frameworks given to it by practical theology, particularly in terms of critical pedagogy and decolonial education, is how much do we have to change? Not just the ways in which we change, and not just the ways in which we teach, but also maybe the means by which we teach and the language and the concepts that we are still working with are seen as being normative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Reddie, for that. Very thought-provoking, very challenging challenge at the end to South African practical theologians. At this stage, we would like to invite Professor Rothney Tshaka. He's in our audience, and I'll just introduce him briefly so you know where he's from. We want to welcome him and say thank you for so kindly responding to the invitation to be a respondent. He's a leading scholar in Black theology from UNISA, and when he's not focused on his publications, he is the school director of the School of Humanities, and he has been in university management, I think, since 2012. He has a master's at the Free University of Amsterdam, and a PhD from the University of Stellenbosch in 2005. And so we want to welcome him, and he is more than able to respond to this paper. So welcome, Professor Tshaka. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, Prof. Naidoo, colleagues, and thank you also to Professor Reddie for this paper. So I am aware of the fact that we are pressed for time, and so I'm just going to go straight to the paper, if that is okay. So let me start by saying that this paper that Reddie has just read is taking place at the backdrop of a terrible pandemic that had caught the world ill prepared for it. We have seen during this time how rich countries reverted to hoarding resources, reminiscent of our historical times of struggle for survival. The theme of this conference of the Practical Theology of South Africa reads, Practical Theology in the Context of Responsible Citizenship, Looking Back and Forward in a Complex South Africa. So questions of responsible citizenship are particularly important given the fact that South African society, although belatedly, is driving the transformation of strategic sectors, some of which, of course, also include universities, with some enthusiasm. To that effect, the contribution that Reddie makes through his paper, that is, to speak to the question, among others, of education, a notorious subject, if one recalls the history of South Africa, is indeed an apt contribution. And so I really appreciate Anthony Reddie for his contribution. You've already heard that he is a seasoned scholar, and I've got similar interest as he in Black theology. I am no practical theologian, but it is indeed a pleasure to respond to this paper. We have heard that he's an A-rated NRF researcher, and that he has also been the one who is credited for having allowed a new course on James Cone to soon also happen at the Oxford University where he's associated. So Reddie describes his work as a meeting point of Black theology and practical theology. In this case, Reddie believes that his work uses a framework of radical liberative modalities of education as a tool for carrying out practical theology. He does this primarily to raise awareness among ordinary lay people and those preparing for public Christian service. He concentrates on a participatory approach here, using role-play, games, exercises, and the like, in the aim of contributing to the theory and practice of Black theology in some way. And it is equally serious in raising awareness of racism among white participants. The essential work of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed informs this radical liberative approach of teaching. He recognizes that he is not the only one who has benefited from this work, and thus refers us to Gustavo Gutierrez, one of South Africa's most well-known Latin American theologians. I say this because there truly is no connectivity between South Africa and Latin America, and this is largely as a result of the difficulty of language both ways. Nonetheless, there are many challenges that we and they have in common, both comparable and dissimilar. In Reddie's account, this work by Freire follows an extensive appreciation. He writes, Freire's concern for the radical and revolutionary intent of education as the basis for the socio-political change forms the underlying epistemological framework for my pedagogical approach to teaching and engaging in practical theology. He continues to explicate practical theology and says, practical theology is the overall framework to the Christian faith that uses differing models of thinking, such as psychology, counseling, education, sociology, and anthropology, for example, as ways of looking at God's action in the world, close quote. While the conception of practical theology and the supplemental subjects to which he refers are important for him in providing a holistic awareness of the human being and his or her relationship with God, one would have liked to hear how Reddie challenges these notions. I am here reminded of Audre Lorde's "The Master's Tool will never dismantle the Master's house," which is interestingly also the quotation that Reddie has just mentioned. We have by now realized why a deconstruction of these concepts is important, all the way down to the concept of education itself. Practical theology, like all other categories of theology utilized in academic space, must be deconstructed so that it accommodates communities that it ignores. The fact that concepts like practical theology, which employs disciplines like psychology, etc., as indicated by Reddie, has yet to be deconstructed, highlights the enormous challenge ahead of us in Africa today. I'm arguing that templates employed are flawed since they don't always account for Black people's lived experiences. When it comes to the topic of irrelevant templates, the words of the American psychologist Joseph White are usually comforting for me. He writes, "It is critically crucial that we build out of the actual experience of Black people an accurate, workable theory of Black psychology, regardless of what Black people finally decide about the concerns of separation, integration, segregation, revolution, or reform." He adds, "Understanding the lifestyles of Black people using typical theories devised by white psychologists to describe white people is extremely difficult, if not impossible. Furthermore, when these old beliefs are applied to the lives of Black people, many inaccurate, weakness-centered, and inferiority-focused conclusions emerge. The issue of education also needs to be deconstructed because it ignores, as I say, the lived experiences of those who are not affiliated with Christianity. My second point, who is an appropriate conversational partner? The history of South Africa demonstrates that Christianity and education go hand in hand. It was Achima Fejo whose research with Black communities in the township of Langa outside of Cape Town made me aware that not belonging to the Christian faith was enough justification to conclude that you're a barbarian. While the research was probing, the question of who is educated between Christians and those refusing to be Christianized, it must be added that there are further layers within the Christian fold itself in South Africa. For instance, if you did not belong or you do not belong to some of the mainland church traditions, such as Catholic, Anglican, Protestants, Methodists, etc., academic theology was quite content to cluster those falling outside of that category as belonging to sects, even if the belief in Christ was central. I mentioned this difficulty briefly when I refer to Mafeja just now. Nonetheless, the mentality is widespread across the continent. Therefore, people like Kofi Asari Opoku wonder aloud, has there been no supernatural intervention in Africa until the arrival of Western Christianity? This is further exacerbated by a South African academic theology that has generated divisions between those who study at universities and seminaries and those who connect Christianity to African cultures. As a result, not only are the latter not regarded as proper conversational partners by the aforementioned theology, but they are also not considered conversational partners by the elite Black theology hell-bent on gaining a foothold in South African theological politics. As we seek for an education that is inclusive of the majority's lived experiences, it is this particularity that requires more attention. So the idea that the Christian faith had come to enlighten John Conrad's dark continent is a tangible idea which is averse to questions of Africanization and or decolonization. We must guard against the dangers of universality. The Eritrean African philosopher Tsanai Sarakubaran has said this most poignantly when he averred, in the name of the universality of values, European colonialism violently universalized its own singular particularity and annihilated the historicity of the colonized, close quote. It is common knowledge that African colleges have greatly Africanized their staff, but not their curricular or pedagogical systems. It is also well known that the colonial effort succeeded as an ideology by dividing the colonized from the colonizer. These binaries were then ingested by both groups to such an extent that undoing what has been ingested remains a difficult undertaking. As a result, any attempt to address colonialism's ills must be supported by clear examples of how to reverse the advantages earned by colonialism. As a result, for me, Africanization remains a concept that is both physical and, more importantly, abstract. The failure of African educational systems to relate norms and quality to the needs and situations of Africans, according to Mahmoud Bamdani, has resulted in an intelligentsia with little endurance for the development process whose vanguards they profess to be. A clear example of this may be observed in who leads universities in South Africa today. Despite the fact that almost all university principals are Black, there is no deliberate attempt to ensure that marginal knowledges are pushed to the fore. I believe the reason for this are varied, but what intrigues me is that the mottos that adorn these institutions are privileging the dead language of Latin over South African indigenous languages. I further note that the Latin term lux, which means light, appears in the majority of these university mottos. This is so because there is a historical linkage of Christianity to the Enlightenment that is supposedly brought with it to Joseph Conrad's dark continent. Seen this way, one can understand why initiatives to alter the ethos of these institutions would face significant obstacles. Francis Jamjo uses a poem of a Ugandan poet, Okot Bitek, titled Song of Lowina and Song of Okol in his work, Potted Plants in Greenhouses, a critical reflection on the resilience of colonial education in Africa. And this poem engages in a radical conversation with African cultural perspectives, bringing current Western education culture into radical conversation with African cultural viewpoints. The book resembles Carter Woodson Johnson's The Miseducation of the Negro in an intriguing way. Even though it was published in 1966, the poem is a painful depiction of the current state of education on the African continent. For Namjo, education for Africans has, in the main, tended to be an exercise in self-evacuation and devaluation of all that took pre-colonial generations wisdom, cultural creativity, and sweat to realize. The fact that Africans have placed and continue to place a very high premium on getting educated in the West or in local variants and franchises of European and North American institutions has only compounded the problem. In South Africa, for example, despite multiple local universities and a reasonably lengthy history of university education, a PhD from Britain or the USA is still considered higher than anything gained locally. Namjo says, South Africans, like other Africans, have an instinct to question one another and others. Where did you get your degree? Depending on the university you mention, you could be considered a superior, an equal, or an inferior by a fellow professor. Some Africans choose to attend Oxford, Harvard, or the Sorbonne, even if it means modifying their specialty to fit the limited academic offerings that these heavyweight Western institutions have. Africans continue to enter Europe and North America to explore parts of their own countries, primarily for the prestige and status that studying abroad affords, only to return as disillusioned and incomplete Africans. Parents continue to send their children to Europe, North America, and other parts of the world for education, believing that a degree from a commercialized and second-rate Western university is worth a lot more opportunities than one from a supposedly top African university. Unless such African universities are those that are commonly perceived as Western universities in Africa, such as some in South Africa. So it is important that we mention this because there is no way that we can start a conversation about who our conversational partners are if we are still hell-bent on a xenophilia that encourages what I like to call a flight from the Black self. Namjo highlights important points that should not be overlooked by anyone interested in challenging the current African curricula. Could this extraversion and xenophilia in educational matters explain the difficulty to significantly reform curriculum, even though their irrelevance is generally acknowledged? Could this also explain the frequently absurd concern with upholding inherited standards without questioning them? African scholars are destined to consume not books and research outputs of their own manufacture or choosing, but what their rich and better positioned colleagues in North America and Europe produce and enforce. My concluding remarks. Theology in South Africa needs to reassess its particularity. And this means reassessing the context in which it happens. It also needs to acknowledge its contribution to the flight from the Black self, which was assisted by the deliberate disregard for anything African. The binaries between those who are educated and therefore Christian versus those who are unchristian and therefore backward has always been used to determine who should be a conversational partner for hegemonic theology in South Africa. It is significant that those who are aligned with the sentiments of Wamba Dia Wamba, who avert in today's Africa to think is increasingly to think for or against the Eurocentric metaphysics of the West and the perpetual subordination at all levels. To insist for a deconstruction of concepts and templates that perpetuates those falling outside the realm of the established Christianity as barbaric. African theology's deconstructive tendency aims to expose these Eurocentric vestiges in modern Africa that continue to condone Africa's political subordination and intellectual dominance under the garb of science and enlightenment. This subordination is ultimately based on the misconception of Western metaphysical tradition, which is concretely rooted in the institutional strictures left over from colonialism and internalized conscious self-awareness of Europeanized Africans. I think I'm going to park here. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, thank you. Professor Tshaka, I thought you were going to come through the screen. You were so passionate. Speaking about the lived experience of black people's lives. Unfortunately, Professor Reddie, there is no time to respond to all those many points, but I see there was a lot of agreement with you nodding your head and agreeing. Unfortunately, we have only about 10 minutes to take questions, so we will have to move on to the audience. But thank you, Professor Tshaka. You did an excellent job, and you seem to have rattled the cages here, and that is quite typical of of your presentation. What could be expected. So thank you again. Okay, I will just read a question that I have that has come through the chat. Maybe we could start with that, and then Professor Siamanga Kumalo, I think he is there on that side, and I can't see the audience. So I think he's going to try and see if others in the audience there have some questions. But here's a question here from Fred George, and he asks, what are the specific ways practical theologians can accelerate radical transformation of the poor and the oppressed through Christian education in terms of learning and practice? Do you want me to repeat that?
No, that's okay. I mean, obviously, this is a huge topic, so I can do nothing more really than just sort of scratch the surface and make a couple, I think, hopefully, fairly practical ways of doing that. I think one of the interesting contexts I wrestle with is where education takes place. And I think increasingly we are seeing, certainly in the UK, a way of trying to help people to do theology in their front rooms, in the spaces where people feel engaged and feel safe. I think part of the colonization of knowledge is the physicality of having to go into an institution where you know that institution was never created with you in mind in the first place. So, for example, a lot of the work I've tried to do is to go back to what the Latin liberation theology used to call base communities, and say, well, how then do we find those local places where people can sit and where the education is rooted in their points of departure? So you start with, so what are the practical issues with which you are wrestling with, and what are the faith-based responses to that? Some of which may come from the canon of existing learning, but actually, most critically, some of it may not even come from that at all. Some of it may actually come from some of the folk wisdom that we have been taught to disparage and to overlook. So one of the things I will say very quickly is, it's only now in my 50s that I realised how much I learned from my grandmother's knee when I went to visit her in Jamaica when I was 17 years old. Now, to be clear, here's a woman who left school when she was 11 and never traveled more than 20 miles from the place where she was born. And it's only now when I think back of some of the things she said, luckily I brought a tape recorder with me, because it was one of only 2 times I met her, that when I met her, she was in her 80s and she died age 97. And so I brought a tape recorder, and we would sit on the veranda and we would talk. And it's only now, looking back, I can see that some of the values that I now call Black liberation theology did not come from James Cone, they came from my grandmother. And so therefore, part of what we have to do when we talk about how do we kind of
Sorry.
Yeah. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Anthony. I think I will move to Professor Kumalo. Maybe there's someone with a question in the audience, and he can ask the question.
Thank you. Any question, colleagues? Question or comment after these brilliant presentations by both Professor Reddie and Professor Tshaka? Really appreciated. So can we engage?
My challenge is between these two now. So, yeah, let's ask.
Yeah. Any question? Well, whilst people are reflecting and thinking about this, I was actually reminded of a good and what I think is a very, very glaring example of what you were referring to, both you, Anthony, and Professor Tshaka, that it is always very difficult for most of the Africans that I know who have degrees and in theology and have been ordained and all that, to actually conduct a simple sermon in the township from the beginning up to the end in their own language without including any English language. I've hardly, and it's a struggle that I myself battle with all the time. Just to be able to start a sermon, the whole congregation, I'm from KwaZulu-Natal, the whole congregation is Black, everybody speaks and listens to Zulu and all that. But just to start a sermon from the beginning of the service to the end, and especially when it gets to real theological concepts that needs to be unpacked and all that, the temptation is to switch into English in the middle of the sermon with the thinking that you are actually making it easy for people to understand what you are talking about because it is so complex, when we are actually making it more difficult for them to understand because we are now speaking in the English language. So it is actually a typical example of this challenge that we have. I'm just wondering if you would like to make a comment or respond to that, if really this is talking to the issue that you are talking about, because I think it's so important. Thank you.
No, I think you're correct, Prof. And I must admit, I must start by saying we're all part of that same problem. We're all part of that same problem. You know, there's a very interesting argument that Dwight Hopkins make in one of his books, and he speaks about the castle. And he says, you are part of the castle, whether you are owner of the castle or whether you are a worker of the castle, you're part of the castle. And I think it starts by that. When we first admit that we are part of the problem, then we can then get to a space where we say, how do we correct this? Now, the issue of language is very, very important. You know, there are many African philosophers who insist that philosophy, wisdom comes in the way that you express yourself, in the language that you dream of. And there's a very interesting novel by a Nigerian author, Amos Tutula, who writes, and the title of that is the Palm Wine Drinker. And this is one of the first African novels that were published in English outside of Africa, and it was published in 1952. And the reviews about that novel, were more hell-bent on speaking about the fact that this is a person that did not go to university. I mean, the fact that he was not to university, but was able to write that. But what he does is that he breaks the English language and forces the language to do what he wants to do with it. Now, of course, for the English people, that is one of the greatest sins that you can do to this thing that they call their language. But the point is that sometimes we are so hell-bent on trying to prove to the West and to whites that we can do this in your languages. And in doing that, we don't do enough to invest in our own. You see, so that is basically the issue, that how do we do this in an intentional way? And the problem in most cases is that we find ourselves not having enough intentionality when we do things.
Oh, thank you, Professor Tshaka. There is another question that's come from Vuyani Magezi, and he's asking, how do we shift the black self? How do we shift from the black self when the accolades we enjoy are only accessed through the colonial precepts and standards, for instance, the NRF rating system, which privileges networks with Western partners and much less local partners? Maybe Professor Tshaka, you can answer, or Professor Rothney, because he's also NRF rated.
Yeah, of course.
So he's also exposed to the.
Let me just do that briefly, then I can allow him to come in. I think the first, that's what I'm saying. We need to be honest about this. And being honest is to admit that, listen, we are part of this. We are part of this system. But it also says, what do I do to intentionally work against this? How do I roll back the flight from the black self? You know, one way of doing that would be to be intentional, to have those that we have not regarded as proper Christians, as I have mentioned, to have them as conversational partners. I mean, there's no way that we're able to really transform theology if we are going to continue to look at our brothers and sisters who congregate in the shacks, what Vuyani Velem call the zinc forest, if we intentionally ignore them as conversational partners, because those are indeed the people whose lived experiences we want to bring to the fore. The other problem is that by being in a university, as a professor in a university, I need to acknowledge that I really cannot speak about the masses as if I am part of the masses like I used to be, because that there is a degree of insincerity in doing that. I think we need to have some disclaimers to say, you know, even though I am Black and I share a particular struggle, I currently cannot speak authoritatively about the masses. So a genuine theology is what we require, that is going to ask for collective wisdom for how do we move from one point to the other.
I would certainly agree with everything that Professor Tshaka has just said. I think the only addition I would make is that I've always been struck by the concept that came up from the great W.E.B. Du Bois, who spoke about double consciousness and about this sense of the Black self having these two realities that were at war with each other in terms of our internalized sense of self and what we know to be true, and that to be juxtaposed with a way of being and knowing in the world that is dominated by white supremacy, that is often seen us as objects and not subjects. More recently, the work of a number of scholars have begun to say that is true, but it didn't have to be a negative factor. Actually, one of the things about double consciousness is that we know instinctively that Black people have always had double ways of knowing, that at our best, what we've always been able to do is to be in the slave master's house. And we know that we have to play a certain game in order to progress. But yet we also know that even whilst we're doing that, just the very nature of what we do is subversive, because that we were never meant to be there in the first place doing it. And so long as we always carry a double consciousness attitude about us, that even when we are engaging in the most mainstream of activities, and certainly, like Professor Tshaka, I have to live with the liminality that I work at Oxford University. I cannot pretend that I have any relationship to the masses in the way in which I once was, given this privileged seat of learning in which I sit. But I think how I try to work subversively is that every time I sit and I'm teaching a group of students, I'm sat in a place that never expected me to be here, teaching what I'm doing when this place was first being conceived. Therefore, whilst I think there can be ways in which we can fool ourselves and we can be a kind of engaged in a kind of sort of self-deception about what it is we think we're doing, if we're honest about it, what we can also do is take that insider knowledge and use it to help other people to strategize around their own journeys of learning and education.
Thank you, Professor Reddie. I'm not sure if there's any more contributions from the floor. Questions?
Not really.
Okay, so then we are going to thank our keynote speaker, Professor Reddie. Thank you for kindly accommodating this conference and agreeing immediately to be a speaker for those insights. And Professor Tshaka, the point about practical theology must be deconstructed if it does not attend to the lived experience of Black people. That was a challenge indeed. So thank you too. We appreciate your passionate delivery. Thank you, colleagues, both of you. And we will close the session right now. So yes. Let us give a round of applause to our two speakers. They've done a brilliant job and really engaged this topic about where is practical theology moving towards.